I'm very glad to be here, and I would like to thank the organizing committee to having invited me, especially Mr. Vigneault and Cribier. I have to say to introduce my series of short talks that I am not a specialist in particle physics, so what could a generalist historian of science bring to a conference full of experts in neutrino physics? Maybe a way to shift the focus a bit. I will consider it as my job during these 3 short talks to convince you that the history of the neutrino is not only a history of great intellectual discoveries and wonderful new techniques, but also from end to end a history of the 20th century, a history of nations, politics and war, a history of institutions and social changes, all deeply intertwined. This history starts during the interwar period, as several speakers have reminded us this morning. It is precisely at this time that the way of doing science, and physics especially, started to resemble something we know nowadays. Actually, the interwar period was a period of major changes for science that we can't understand without calling back to the beginning of the century, and particularly the First World War. Let's remind ourselves briefly what physics looked like at the turn of the century. An overwhelming majority of physicists were working in Western Europe. American universities were still small and distant institutions in a quickly developing but isolated country. Most scholars, who were not yet named researchers, were still amateurs, living off of personal resources, teaching of business activities, or patronage and various grants. Work was essentially individual or organized between small groups of people, and what we could call laboratory work was often led at private residences and not in universities. Leading papers were written in German and French, and science was mainly seen among society as an enjoyable inquiry with moral involvement more than a material or economic one. Finally, the existence of atoms had just been completely accepted, and the physics of radiation was bursting into an explosion of new observations, the likes of which fundamental physics hadn't known for a while. The experiments stemming from this whole new continent became the building blocks of quantum theory, as you know, obviously. In this landscape, the First World War was probably the event having the most profound consequences on 20th century science, on par with, or maybe even having more impact than the Second World War. Scientists played a very important role throughout the war. Aviation was used for the first time in a conflict. Submarine use became significant. Chemists developed poisonous gases. Heavy artillery demanded more and more ballistic computations. And meanwhile, the twice Nobelized Marie Curie developed medical radiology to help the Red Cross treating the countless injured soldiers. At the same time, the total war, produced by the clash of the imperialisms among the European states, involved the entire societies resting upon nationalist ideologies. All of this led ruling elites and each nation's society to think of their scientists as a highly useful tool for power. And even if we usually date the end of the First World War in 1918, this schema actually persisted more or less until the Second World War. So, what have been the consequences for physics? Firstly, the professionalization of scientists. The importance of science for national power and the new prominence taken by the states in each nation's society together made science a political and national aim. At the same time, the terrible social conditions of the war aftermath had broken the fragile equilibrium between personal resources and private fundings that once had permitted some scientists to live and work. The time had come to construct national public scientific organizations with staff researchers. In France, it was the CNRS, le Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, planned by the government of the Popular Front and the first Undersecretary for Scientific Research, Irène Joliot-Curie, daughter of Marie Curie and recipient of the 1935 Physics Nobel Prize for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. So scientific research became a professional career during this interwar period, something it had never really been before in European history. Secondly, another direct outcome of this new social place for science, and especially physics, was its incredible penetration into society as a whole, hand in hand with the rise of advertisement or propaganda and the birth of consumerism. Modern physics became synonymous with the power of a nation and with radiant future. Institutions dedicated to popularization of science were built, like the Palais de la Découverte, Discovery Palace, designed by Jean Perrin in Paris. In France, the discovery of radium by Marie Curie inspired in just a few years a now absurd trend of radium consumption. Ads were praising radioactive water or face cream, very good for the complexion, guaranteed, or even radium talk for babies. Finally, the war had been the accelerator that propelled the American economy to worldwide leading position. The center of gravity was still in Germany, but the rapid development of scientific institutions in the United States made the physics community experience a first kind of globalization across the Atlantic Ocean. The most famous example of this internationalization of physics was the organization in Brussels by the Belgian industrial Ernest Solvay of a series of conferences known as the Solvay Conferences, more or less every 3 years, starting from 1911. A large part of the animated debates about the nature of the quantum world and the correct theories to understand it took place there. In a way, these meetings were the first international conferences of theoretical physics, except that at the time, basically, all international theoretical physics could fit in a room. Thank you for your attention, and so see you tomorrow for the next historical interludes.
Usually, young people are not so interested in history. They're interested in making history, but they don't want to know much history. How come you're interested in history?
Oh,
it's a good question. Huh?
Wasn't a question I was prepared for. I studied as a physicist student, but finally found a better way in mixing interest in physics and interest in social sciences and history. So, yeah, history of science has founded me. Thanks.
Short question.
Hello. Yeah.
It works.
It works? Oh, very good. So next year is Eddington's 100th anniversary, 100 years.
Ah.
Yes. And so what impact have you studied? Is that a very big in your considerations? Because after the war, as I understand it, this occupied the imagination of the world like nothing else had, namely the bending of light and the announcement of that. That was a...
The Eddington
Yeah,
work?
yeah.
Eddington
So you're
observation
talking
is
about,
1917.
about the eclipse and
Absolutely.
the general relativity?
Yes.
I'm not a specialist of the history of general relativity. What I could say is the reception of this theory has been really particular. And I'm not sure that most of physicists would have accepted it easily before the 40s or 50s, or maybe considering it as a weird thing, a bit separated from other physics theories. But history of physics at the 20th century is pretty young, and especially after the Second World War, it's younger even, so I can't say more.
Okay. So I think we will close the session. So I would like to thank... just a comment.
I mean, I have seen in the Nobel archives a long, long time ago, they had absolutely no respect for Eddington. They made some vicious statements about him that I would not like to repeat. They simply didn't, I mean, not that they didn't only believe his experimental results. I mean, his the exhibition. No, it's not called. He went to Brazil, right, to look at the.
I have a picture of him in my
Yeah, you have a picture of him, and it's like your lecture. Good for you. It's okay. I don't say they were right. I'm not saying they were right or wrong, but they thought that, you know, he had not considered the exhaust gases and things like that. I don't. There were all sorts of problems, and that he was looking for fame, you know, and that was very bad in their eyes. That you're looking for fame and not just for knowledge. So, I think, Pierre, you should look and see if these are right or wrong. I don't know. I have no idea.
Excuse me, you didn't understand my question. My question is that this was a world event.
Yeah, it was.
Irrespective of anything.
It was.
And after killing each other, people could actually understand something about the universe, like nothing else.
Yes.
And so the impact on society, I thought, was very, very
Yes,
important,
absolutely.
irrespective of.
Yes, yeah,
I'm
sure.
sorry.
Because it was in all newspapers and things like that. That's true.
Okay,
Well,
yeah,
to-
yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I understand
sure,
more.
sure.
And it's linked to the fact that Albert Einstein became the first scientist superstar in popular society. True, but it's after the period I choose for this first interview. So yeah, I will talk more about this tomorrow.
Thank you. So let's thank all the speakers of this very interesting session again.